When I asked my son's husband what time the wedding was, he said, "Oh, we already got married." My name is Robert Callahan. I am 61 years old, and for 3 years I did not speak to my only son. And I am going to tell you exactly how I lost him, and exactly how I almost lost him forever, because I think somewhere out there is another father sitting in a quiet kitchen the way I used to sit, angry for reasons he can't fully explain even to himself. And I want that man to hear what happened to me before it's too late for him too. My son's name is Daniel. He is 31 now, though in my head he is still 9 years old, riding his bike too fast down Miller Street with his elbows out like wings, laughing so hard he nearly tipped over, and I still remember catching him once, scooping him up off the pavement before his knee could hit the concrete, and thinking, this is what I'm here for, this exact thing, catching him. I want you to understand that I loved my son before I go on, because everything that happened next doesn't make sense unless you understand that the love was never the problem. The problem was me, and what I thought love was supposed to look like, and how long it took me to understand that I had it backwards the whole time. Daniel told us he was gay when he was 20 years old, home from college for Thanksgiving, and I remember the exact chair I was sitting in, the good armchair by the fireplace that used to be my father's, and I remember my wife Linda setting down a dish of mashed potatoes so carefully, like the room itself might shatter if she moved too fast, and I remember Daniel's hands shaking as he said it. Like he'd rehearsed this 100 times in his dorm room, and it still wasn't enough rehearsal for the real thing. And I did not throw anything, I did not yell, I did not say a single cruel word that night. And for years afterward I told myself that meant I had handled it well, that I had been a good father about it, because I hadn't screamed, because I hadn't kicked him out, because I still passed him the potatoes and asked him to pass the gravy. But silence is its own kind of cruelty, and I gave my son 3 years of silence disguised as tolerance, and tolerance disguised as love, and I think now that might have hurt him more than shouting ever could have, because shouting at least tells a person where they stand, and what I gave Daniel instead was a slow, cold, polite distance that never once said the words he needed to hear, which were simply, "I love you, and nothing about this changes that." I didn't say those words. I said things like, "as long as you're happy," in a voice that made it clear I didn't quite believe happiness was what this was. And I said, "we still love you, of course," in a tone flat enough that even I could hear how hollow it sounded coming out of my own mouth. And worst of all, I stopped asking him questions. I stopped asking about his life. Before that Thanksgiving, I used to call him every Sunday, ask him about his classes, ask him about his friends, ask him what he was reading. And after that Thanksgiving, the calls got shorter and then less frequent. And I told myself it was because he was busy with school, because that's what 20-year-olds are busy. But the truth was I had stopped asking because I was afraid of what he might tell me. Afraid he might mention a boy's name the way he used to mention girls' names when he was in high school, and some ugly, small, frightened part of me did not want to hear it. I want to be honest with you about that fear, because I think it's the thing nobody talks about enough. It wasn't discussed, not really, though I told myself for a long time that it was some kind of moral objection, some version of my father's voice in my head, my father who was a hard man from a different generation, a man who never once said he was proud of anything I did, a man whose approval I chased my entire childhood and never quite caught. I think what I actually felt was fear that I had somehow failed as a father, that there was something I had done or not done that had made my son turn out this way, some question of blame that I couldn't answer. And instead of sitting with that fear and working through it like an adult, I just quietly withdrew, the way a man pulls his hand back from a stove without ever admitting out loud that it was hot. Daniel met Ethan during his last year of college. I know this now, though at the time I knew almost nothing about Ethan except a first name mentioned once in an email that I remember reading 3 times before I even wrote back. An email where Daniel said casually, almost like a test, "I've been seeing someone, his name is Ethan, he's studying architecture." And I wrote back one line, "That's nice. Hope classes are going well." And I did not ask a single question about this person who would go on to become the most important person in my son's life. And I think about that email more than almost anything else from those years, because it was a door Daniel opened for me, an invitation, and I just didn't walk through it. Linda handled things differently than I did, though not by much, if I'm honest. She cried the night Daniel told us, not out of grief exactly. She told me later, but out of fear for him, fear of a world she imagined would be cruel to her son, fear of things happening to him that she couldn't protect him from the way she used to be able to fix a scraped knee with a Band-Aid and a kiss. But Linda kept calling him. She kept asking questions, even careful, tiptoeing questions, and slowly over the years she learned Ethan's favorite color and Ethan's mother's name, and the fact that Ethan made incredible enchiladas. And she told me these things at dinner sometimes, testing whether I wanted to hear them, and mostly I just nodded and changed the subject. And I think that hurt her almost as much as it hurt Daniel, because she was trying to build a bridge and I kept letting my half of it crumble. The years went by like that. Daniel finished school, got a job at an engineering firm 2 states away, built a life I knew almost nothing about, a life that included Ethan in every important way, an apartment they shared, a rescue dog named Biscuit that I only knew existed because Linda showed me a photo on her phone, holidays that Daniel started spending with Ethan's family instead of ours, which I told myself was just scheduling, just distance, just the natural drift of adult children, and never let myself examine the real reason underneath it, which was that our house had never once felt fully safe for him to bring the person he loved. Then came the day I am telling you about, the day that changed everything. Though it started so ordinarily, I almost didn't recognize it as the beginning of anything. It was a Sunday in early spring, and Linda had invited Daniel and Ethan over for dinner, something that had become slightly more frequent over the past year. A small thaw I hadn't examined too closely because I was afraid that if I looked directly at it, it might stop. Ethan had been to our house maybe 4 or 5 times by then, always polite, always a little careful around me the way you're careful around a dog that might or might not bite, and I regret to say I had done nothing to earn any more trust than that. That Sunday, over pot roast, Linda asked the question that started it all. She'd been talking about calendars, about scheduling a family trip
अब
for the summer,
दरवाजा बंद करो।
and she
कामी,
turned to
अब तो
Daniel
जलेबियां
and
बनती
Ethan
हैं।
and
आज
asked,
सबके लिए
brightly,
मुफ्त
the
जलेबियां।
way she
अक्ल और
always
हिम्मत
asked
से हर
things
मुश्किल
she was
आसान हो
nervous
जाती है।
about.
कामी पूरे
"So
गांव
have
का
you
हीरो
two
बन
picked
गया।
a date yet? For the wedding?" I remember setting down my fork. I remember feeling something in my chest that I couldn't name at the time, something between curiosity and dread, because somewhere in the last year Daniel had mentioned, quietly, almost as an aside during a phone call I'd mostly listened to in silence, that he and Ethan were engaged, and I had said something like congratulations, in the same flat voice I always used, and had not asked a single follow-up question, not about a date, not about a venue, not about anything. Because some coward part of me still didn't know how to be a father to this particular piece of my son's life. So when Linda asked about the date, I looked up, actually looked at both of them for maybe the first time all evening, and Ethan glanced at Daniel, and Daniel looked down at his plate, and there was a silence that went on just a beat too long, and then Ethan said, gently, carefully, like he was setting down something breakable, "Oh, we already got married. Back in October." It was small, just us and a few friends at the courthouse, and then dinner after. I want you to understand what that sentence did to me. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was something closer to falling, like the floor of the kitchen had simply dropped away and I was sitting in my chair in midair. My son had gotten married. My only child had stood up in front of people and made vows and started a marriage, the single largest event of his adult life outside of maybe being born, and I had not been there. I had not walked him anywhere, had not given any kind of toast, had not shaken his husband's hand as a new son, had not done any of the thousand small fatherly things I used to imagine doing when Daniel was small, and I pictured his wedding day the way fathers do, in some hazy future montage in my head, me in a suit, me getting emotional during a speech, me dancing with my son the way my own father never once danced with me. All of that had already happened without me. Months ago, in October, while I was doing something completely ordinary like raking leaves or watching a football game, and I hadn't even known enough to be sad about it because I hadn't known it was happening at all. Linda made a small sound, not quite a gasp, more like the air going out of her, and she reached over and grabbed Daniel's hand across the table, and I watched my wife's face do something complicated, hurt and love and something like understanding all at once. And she said, "Oh, honey," in a voice that cracked slightly, and Daniel's eyes were wet, and he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, "I didn't think you'd want to be there." 6 words. I didn't think you'd want to be there. I have turned that sentence over in my mind every single day since, because it wasn't said with anger. It wasn't a weapon. It was worse than that. It was simple fact, stated the way you'd state the weather. My son genuinely, honestly, without malice, believed that his own father would not want to attend his wedding. And the terrible thing is that for years I had given him every reason to believe exactly that. I want to tell you that I said the right thing in that moment, that I reached across the table and took his other hand and told him how wrong he was, but I didn't. I sat there. I sat there in my chair in my own kitchen while my son and his husband and my wife all waited to see what I would do, and what I did was nothing, for what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds, and in the silence I watched something close in my son's face, some small hope flickering out, some door quietly shutting, and I understood in that moment that I was about to lose something I might never get back if I didn't move, actually move, right then. So I stood up. My chair scraped back loud against the floor and Linda flinched and Ethan flinched and Daniel looked up at me with an expression I will never forget, braced, the way you brace for bad weather. And I walked around the table past Linda, past the pot roast going cold, and I knelt down next to my son's chair, which is not something a 61-year-old man's knees enjoy doing. And I said the truest thing I have ever said to another human being, which was, "I'm sorry." Just that at first. "I'm sorry." And then more came out, messy and unrehearsed, nothing like the careful sentences I'd practiced in my head over the years and never once said out loud. I told him I was sorry I hadn't asked more questions. Sorry I had let 3 years slip by treating his life like something to be quietly endured instead of celebrated. Sorry that he had grown up thinking his own father's love came with conditions. And I told him I was proud of him, actually proud, and that I wanted, desperately, to know everything I had missed, every detail of that October day at the courthouse, what he wore, what Ethan wore, what they ate for dinner after, who was there, what song, if any, they danced to. And Daniel started crying then, really crying, the kind of crying that comes out of a person after they've been holding something in for years. And I held him the way I used to hold him when he was small and had fallen off his bike, except this time there was no cut knee to bandage. Just 3 years of distance that needed tending to instead. Ethan sat very still through all of this, and when I finally straightened up, my knees cracking audibly, I turned to him, and for the first time I really looked at him, not as an idea, not as a category, not as the reason I had been avoiding my son's phone calls, but as a person, a young man with kind eyes and an anxious set to his shoulders, a person who clearly loved my son enormously and had been treated by me, his father-in-law, with something close to indifference for years, and I said to him, "I owe you an apology too, a bigger one probably. I've been a coward and you deserved better than that from the start." Ethan's eyes filled up and he said, "Thank you," in a voice that shook a little, and then he said something that stuck with me. He said, "I used to tell Daniel that fathers come around eventually, that you just needed time, but I think I said that mostly because I wanted it to be true, not because I was sure it was. That dinner did not fix everything in one night." And I want to be honest about that too, because I think stories like this sometimes make it sound too easy. One apology and suddenly everything is healed. But that isn't how real relationships work, especially ones that have been neglected for years. What that dinner did was open a door, and then it was up to me to actually walk through it every day after in small ways. I started calling Daniel every week again, the way I used to, Except now I asked real questions about Ethan, about their apartment, about Biscuit the rescue dog who I finally met in person a month later, and who turned out to have exactly one eye and an enormous amount of enthusiasm for anyone holding a tennis ball. I asked Ethan about his architecture work, and it turned out he was designing a community center back in his hometown, and I asked him question after question about it because I found I genuinely wanted to know. And somewhere in those months of phone calls and visits, my son-in-law stopped flinching slightly when I walked into a room and started actually relaxing around me, laughing at my terrible jokes the way Daniel always had as a kid. Linda and I talked a lot during that time too, late at night, the kind of conversations we hadn't had in years, and she told me things I hadn't
अब
fully
दरवाजा बंद
understood.
करो।
How
कामी,
much she had
अब तो
grieved
जलेबियां
during
बनती
those
हैं।
3
आज
quiet
सबके लिए
evenings.
मुफ्त जलेबियां।
Not for the
अक्ल
son
और
she
हिम्मत
had,
से
who
हर
was
मुश्किल आसान
thriving,
हो जाती है।
who had
कामी
built a
पूरे
good
गांव का
life
हीरो
and
बन
found
गया।
someone who clearly adored him, but for the relationship between that son and his father, which had gone dim in a way she didn't know how to fix on her own. And she told me she was proud of me for finally seeing it, though she also gently made clear that pride didn't erase the years, that I still had work to do, real work, not just good intentions. About 4 months after that dinner, Daniel called me on a Tuesday evening, and I could hear in his voice that something was different, lighter somehow, and he said, "Ethan and I have been talking. We know we already did the legal part back in October, the courthouse thing, just the two of us, because at the time neither of us really believed our families would want to be part of it. But we've been thinking about maybe doing something else. A ceremony. Nothing legal, just a celebration. With everyone there this time. Would you want to come to that? Would you want to be part of it?" I did not hesitate before answering, not the way I used to hesitate over questions like this, and I said, "There is nothing in this world I want more." Planning that ceremony became, strange as it sounds, one of the best periods of my adult life. Linda threw herself into it with the kind of joy she used to have planning Daniel's childhood birthday parties, and I found myself, for the first time, actually asking to be included in the planning, instead of hanging back the way I used to at every family event that touched on Daniel's life. I asked Daniel what kind of flowers he liked. I asked Ethan about his family traditions, and learned that Ethan's grandmother used to make a particular kind of bread for celebrations, and I found myself on the phone with her, a woman I had never met, asking if she would teach me how to make it too, so that both families could have a hand in the same tradition, and she laughed and said, "Well, Robert, I suppose that's the nicest thing anyone's asked me in years." And we spent an entire Saturday afternoon on video call while she walked me through kneading dough, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for longer than I wanted to admit. The day of the ceremony arrived on a bright Saturday in September, in a backyard strung with string lights that Ethan's sister had spent all week hanging, and I remember standing at the back of the small gathered crowd, maybe 40 people, friends and family from both sides, and watching my son walk toward the little arch of flowers where Ethan was already waiting. And I remember that Daniel had asked me, just days before, if I would walk partway down the aisle with him, not to give him away. Because he said, laughing, "I'm not property, Dad, but just to walk beside him for that stretch, the way you might walk beside someone at the start of something big," and I said yes before he even finished the sentence. Walking beside my son that day, in the sunlight, watching his face as he looked ahead at the person he loved, I thought about the boy on the bicycle, elbows out like wings, and I thought about the 3 lost years, and I thought about how close I had come to missing this entirely, to being the kind of father who finds out about his son's wedding secondhand, weeks or months later, or worse, never finding out at all, because his son had simply stopped including him in the important things. The way people do when they've learned not to expect support. I did not miss it in the end, though I came closer than I am proud of. When it came time for toasts at dinner, I stood up with a glass of wine in my hand and my voice already shaking, and I did not give a polished speech. I gave an honest one. I told the whole table about the day at the courthouse I had missed, and how it was entirely my own fault, built out of years of silence I had mistaken for tolerance. And I told them that I stood there that night not as a perfect father, because I clearly was not one, but as a father who had learned, late but not too late, that love without full acceptance isn't really love at all. It's just a polite kind of distance. And I told Daniel and Ethan both that I was more proud of the family they had built together than of almost anything else in my life. And I asked everyone to raise a glass not just to the marriage, which had already quietly happened months before in a courthouse without any of us, but to the two of them, and to second chances. And to every father out there who still has time to walk through the door his child has left open, even a crack, even after years of silence, because the door doesn't stay open forever, and I very nearly learned that lesson too late. Daniel hugged me after that speech longer than he had hugged me in years, and Ethan hugged me too, and called me Dad for the first time that night, testing the word out carefully, watching my face to see how I would react. And I told him I had been waiting 3 years to hear that, and I meant it completely. I want to go back for a moment to that Thanksgiving when Daniel first told us, because there are details I left out that I think matter, details I only fully understood years later when I finally asked him to walk me through that night from his side of the table. He told me, long after the ceremony, on one of our Sunday calls, that he had rehearsed the words in his dorm room for almost 2 weeks beforehand, saying them out loud to his roommate over and over until they stopped shaking in his mouth, and that he had chosen Thanksgiving specifically because he thought a full house, a happy occasion, might soften whatever reaction came next, might give him some kind of buffer of goodwill to fall back on if things went badly. He told me he had watched my face very closely in the seconds after he spoke, the way you watch a sky for the first sign of a storm, and that when I didn't yell, when I didn't storm off, some part of him had actually felt relieved, had thought, for a moment, that maybe this would be all right after all. It was only over the following weeks and months, he said, that the relief curdled into something else, because he realized slowly that my calm that night hadn't been acceptance. It had been shock wearing acceptance's mask, and that the quiet, careful distance that followed was in some ways harder to bear than anger would have been, because anger at least would have given him something to push against, some clear line to fight for. While what he got instead was a kind of fog that never lifted and never explained itself. He told me there were nights in college, especially that first year after he came out to us, when he would lie awake replaying our phone calls, the short flat ones, trying to figure out from the length of my pauses and the topics I avoided whether I was disgusted, or embarrassed, or simply indifferent, and that not knowing which one it was became its own private torment, because he loved me enough to want an answer badly, and cared enough about our relationship to be terrified of what that answer might turn out to be. Hearing him describe those nights, years after the fact, in the safety of a good marriage and a settled life, was one of the harder conversations of my own life, because I realized I had caused a kind of suffering I hadn't even been paying close enough attention to notice. The quiet suffering of a son waiting for his father to simply say the words, "I love you exactly as you are," and getting silence instead, dressed up as tolerance. I also want
अब
to tell you
दरवाजा
about
बंद
the
करो
year
कामी
Daniel
अब तो
almost
जलेबियां
didn't
बनती
come
हैं
home for
आज
Christmas
सबके
at
लिए
all,
मुफ्त जलेबियां
because I
अक्ल
think
और
it
हिम्मत से
shows
हर
how
मुश्किल
close
आसान
things
हो
came
जाती
to
है कामी
breaking
पूरे गांव का
permanently
हीरो बन गया
before they ever had the chance to heal. It was his second year with Ethan, and Linda had extended the invitation the way she always did, hopeful and a little too bright, and Daniel had called to say that he and Ethan had actually been invited to spend the holiday with Ethan's family instead, in another state, and that maybe it would just be easier this year to do that. I remember the conversation because I was the one who answered the phone that time, a rare thing by then since Daniel usually called when he knew Linda would pick up, and I remember a long pause on the line after he told me his plan, and I remember him finally asking carefully, testing the water, would that be all right? Would you and Mom be upset? And I said, in the flat voice I used for everything back then, whatever's easiest for you. I did not say, please come home, I miss you. I want to meet the person you love. I said whatever's easiest for you, which sounds polite on paper and was, in practice, an invitation for him to stay away. And he took it. And Ethan's family got my son for Christmas that year while ours sat quieter than it had ever been. And Linda cried in the kitchen on Christmas morning while pretending she had something in her eye. And I sat in the living room pretending I didn't notice. And neither of us said out loud what we both knew, which was that we had built this distance ourselves, brick by brick, out of nothing but our own discomfort, and now we were the ones sitting alone in it. I think about that Christmas often now, especially every December when Daniel and Ethan come to us instead. When the house is loud again with Ethan's terrible taste in Christmas music and biscuit chewing on wrapping paper and Linda's kitchen smelling like the bread Ethan's grandmother taught me to make. And I think about how easily that could have kept going the other direction, holiday after holiday, distance compounding on distance. Until one day Daniel simply stopped extending the invitation to visit at all, not out of cruelty, but out of self-protection. The way anyone eventually stops knocking on a door that never opens. There's a version of this story where that Sunday dinner over pot roast never happens the way it did, where I hear the words, "Oh, we already got married," and I feel that same falling sensation in my chest, and instead of getting up from my chair, I simply sit there, quiet, saying congratulations in my flat voice, letting the moment pass the way I had let so many moments pass before. And in that version of the story, I think Daniel would have gone on loving me from a greater and greater distance. Politely, dutifully, the way you love a relative you've stopped expecting anything real from. And I think eventually the phone calls would have stopped altogether, not out of any single dramatic fight, but simply out of exhaustion. The exhaustion of reaching out again and again towards someone who never quite reaches back. I do not know exactly what made me stand up from that chair, instead of sitting in it the way I always had before. Whether it was something about hearing my son say, "I didn't think you'd want to be there," in that small, resigned voice. The voice of someone who has simply accepted a sad fact about his own father. Or whether 3 years of quiet guilt had simply built up to a breaking point that finally broke in the right direction instead of the wrong one. But I am grateful every single day that it did. Because the distance between almost losing your child's trust forever and actually losing it can be as thin as a single dinner, a single sentence, a single choice to stand up instead of stay seated. It has been 2 years since that ceremony now, and Daniel and Ethan are doing wonderfully. Ethan's community center project was completed last spring, and I flew out for the ribbon cutting, standing in the crowd with an embarrassing amount of pride. And Biscuit, the one-eyed dog, has become something of a fixture at our house whenever they visit. And Linda has a standing weekly video call with Ethan's grandmother where they trade recipes and complain lovingly about their husbands. And I call my son every single Sunday, and I ask him real questions now, and he answers them. And sometimes he calls me during the week too, just to talk, the way he used to before everything went quiet, and I no longer take a single one of those calls for granted. If there is one thing I want anyone listening to this to take away from my story, it is this. The version of love that stays silent to keep the peace is not actually love. It's fear wearing love's clothing, and it will cost you more than you can imagine if you let it run for too long. My son once believed, quietly, honestly, without cruelty, that his own father would not want to attend his wedding, and he was nearly right, not because I didn't love him, but because I had never once shown him that love in a way he could actually feel, and it took a single accidental sentence over pot roast, "Oh, we already got married," to finally crack something open in me that should have cracked open years earlier. I am telling you this because I got a second chance that I did not entirely deserve, and I do not want anyone else to need one. If you have a child of any kind who is loved differently than you expected, or differently than your own father loved you, do not let years slip by in careful, well-mannered silence. Ask the questions. Learn the names. Show up, not just physically but fully, with your whole heart in the room, before the wedding happens without you, before the years pile up into a wall neither of you knows how to climb over, because on the other side of that wall might be the best relationship of your life, waiting for you to finally walk through the door. Last week Daniel called me on a Wednesday, no particular reason, just to talk, and somewhere in the middle of the conversation he mentioned, almost offhand, that he and Ethan had been talking about maybe starting a family someday, adoption most likely, and he asked carefully, the old caution still faintly there in his voice even after everything, whether I thought that was something I'd want to be part of, and I told him the truth, which is that I would crawl over broken glass to be a grandfather to whatever child he and Ethan decide to bring into their home, and that this time, whatever happens, whenever it happens, I plan on showing up for every single bit of it, not politely, not from a careful distance, but with my whole heart in the room, the way I should have from the very beginning. That is the whole story, or at least the whole story so far,